Hey, everybody, welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes, and I am joined by Terry Fakes as we continue our march through the Old Testament. We've come to the end of the Torah and the beginning of the conquest of the Holy Lands. And of course, we are in the book of Joshua this week, talking about where do we see Jesus in the book of Joshua?
Well, you don't have to go very far because it starts with the name Joshua.
Yeah.
Joshua or Yahashua in Hebrew means Yahweh. When we say the Lord saves, it's literally the personal name of God. Yahweh saves, or Yahweh is salvation. And so the name Jesus in Greek is the name Yeshua, Joshua, Yahashua in Hebrew. So Jesus and Joshua have the same name, and it means the same thing, is that Yahweh saves. Now, he saves in a little way with Joshua by bringing his people and fulfilling his promise to bring them into the promised land. And he saves in a very big way with Jesus. But I would say we start right with the name of the book and see a connection to Jesus.
Yeah, so you think about the naming scene in the Gospels where people think, oh, well, maybe he'll be named after his dad, that maybe,
Right,
a family name. No, no, no. We're going to name him Jesus because that's what the angel said. This would have been kind of audacious in some ways to
right.
not pick a family name, but to pick the name Joshua because of its meaning. Did you guys have a relative? No, we wanted to name him Joshua or Yeshua because it means God saves, and that's exactly what he's going to do. I mean, that would have been kind of eye-opening in the first century.
Hmm.
So, God is orchestrating this to show his people something important. Jesus is going to do what Joshua did, but in a much, much, much greater way. And so, yeah, just from the beginning of the book, we see one who's coming who really will save to the uttermost, who really will deliver his people and bring them into the promised land. The hinge that we've just crossed over is from the Torah into the history books, which they would have called prophetic books in
Hmm.
the Jewish scriptures. And Joshua is in some ways a continuation of the ministry of Moses, especially if you think about Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the whole
Hmm.
story of Israel wandering in the desert. Joshua now continues that story by bringing them up to the edge of the Jordan River and bringing them in. What they should have done 40 years before, they're now going to get to do. But Moses has died, Joshua has taken his place. But in some sense, Joshua is a new beginning as well because they've been talking about life in the land for a long time, but they haven't actually done it. And while they did have some conquest under Moses, the conquest is really going to begin under Joshua. So whereas Moses is much more of a spiritual leader, he is leading the people of Israel by giving a law and by teaching. Joshua is going to lead the people of Israel by leading them into battle and by
Hmm.
bringing them into the promised land through a series of military victories.
Yes, I think that's also a foreshadowing in the sense that on the way to the promised land, they will have to confront their enemies. And with Jesus leading us into an eternal promised land, he's going to have to confront the ultimate enemies of sin and death. And so, as Joshua is a military leader, so is Jesus in that sense, that he is the one who's going to confront the great enemies of God's people.
Joshua must have been a fairly impressive person because of what you
Hmm.
read about him in the conquest of the Holy Lands. But at the beginning of the book, in Joshua chapter 1, one of the most famous verses, Joshua 1:9, you see God reassuring Joshua, have I not told you? Be strong and courageous. He actually tells him this twice. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. I mean, some of that I think may have been his personality, but some of
Hmm.
it had to have been following somebody like Moses.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And, of course, you can't help hear the echo of be strong and courageous, for I will be with you. And Jesus at the end of Matthew speaking to his disciples, I will be with you. It's a godlike
Right.
thing to say, is you can put your trust in the fact that I am with you. But yes, can you imagine being Joshua and having to live up to the greatest prophet the Jews had ever seen?
Right. Yeah, so he needs some reassurance. And in doing that, yes, God gives a prescription for all those who are going to take on an enemy, who are going to stand up for what God says, that it's not their strength, it's his presence that's going to
Right.
guide them. And that's what ends up being the deciding factor in the book of Joshua. It's not just the military might of Israel, because you see them win some impressive battles, you see them lose in some very
Right.
unimpressive battles, and the
Right.
the major contributing factor is whether or not they are trusting in God's own plan. We
Hmm.
see this in the book of Jericho, or in the Battle of Jericho, obviously.
Hmm.
And you see this when they lose because they've gone and done what God didn't tell them to do, and they've gotten kind of arrogant in their own military abilities. It all comes down to what God tells Joshua at the very beginning: be strong and courageous because I am with you. Now, you may not think that that applies to Jesus because you think, well, Jesus, he's all powerful, he can do miracles, he can do all of this. But how many times in the New Testament does Jesus say the exact same thing? I only do what my Father tells me to do. You
Hmm.
know, I am submitted to the will of my Father. I obey him. Everything he tells me to do, I do. He's modeling, just like Joshua was to a large extent,
Hmm.
he's modeling that faithful following, understanding the way that God has designed him to accomplish the task and submitting to it, even to the point for Jesus of his own death. You know, he says, "For this reason, the Father loves me because I lay my life down and I take it up again." So he is showing us not just how to be a great leader, but how to be a great follower.
Right. We know you don't have to go very much further to see Jesus. In your notes for this episode, you have something really interesting that I did not include in mine, and this is a big one. It is Rahab. Rahab shows up as a kind of a side character. I mean, it's not the big story, but the Gentile prostitute who receives the scouts into Jericho and covers for them, hides them at the risk of her own life. And so she says, "But please spare me when you take the city, because we know that your God is real, and we know what happened in Egypt." And they said, "Okay, we'll spare you." And so they do. But Rahab goes on to become part of the lineage of Jesus. And here we are in the middle of a God's chosen people at that point, the Jews and their enemies. And here comes one of the Gentiles, Rahab, who gets integrated, or as Paul would probably say, grafted into the tree for the Messiah. And so this incident that almost looks like a side issue, then you get to Matthew and you realize, oh my goodness, she's in the lineage of Jesus.
Yeah, this is a crazy turn of events that happens. You have Rahab, who is unknown to the people of Israel except as an enemy. She shelters the spies that come in, she hides them in her house. There's a crimson thread that runs down out her window, and there's a promise that's made to her that's fulfilled. You could easily think that nothing else is going to come of this, except we see a little glimpse, even in the book of Joshua, of what's going to happen. She gets integrated into the people of Israel. And later we find
Hmm.
out she's the great, great, great grandmother of King David. So, of course, she's in the line of Judah. She marries into the line of Judah. And Matthew picks this up and tells us in his genealogy, there's four women that are listed in the genealogy. All of them are Gentiles. One of them is Rahab, and she is in the line. She not only preserved Israel by helping the spies, but she preserved the line of the Messiah when she married into Israel. And so this is a cool way to see Jesus in the book of Joshua. You actually see the line that God uses, the bloodline that God uses through all the crazy things that happen. He preserves the line all the way down to Mary and to his son Jesus when he comes into the world.
Yes, and so it was always thought that the Messiah would in some way bless all the nations, as was promised to Abraham so long before. And so in the person of Jesus, though, if you remember the book of Acts, it surprises the apostles when they realize, oh, Jesus died for the Gentiles too, and they see that messianic bringing together of the Gentiles, the Jews and the Gentiles, but you see it prefigured all the way back here in the book of Joshua.
I would say one of the weirder scenes in Joshua is also a place where we can see a glimpse of Jesus, or arguably you can see a glimpse of Jesus. And that's in Joshua chapter 5. When they're getting ready for battle, Joshua kind of steps aside from the camp, and all of a sudden he sees this figure holding a sword. And he asks him, "Are you on our team or are you on the other team?" And he doesn't really answer. He just says,
Right.
"I'm the commander of the army of the Lord, and now I have come." You think to yourself, come to do what?
What?
What's the effect here? Who are you fighting for? Well, there's a lot of discussion about what's happening with this figure, this commander of the Lord's armies. Of course, elsewhere, we see a commander of the Lord's armies named Michael, an angel who's
Mm-hmm.
leading the armies of heaven against Satan in the book of Revelation, for example. Could this be him? But
Mm-hmm.
then what you see there is he commands Joshua to take off his shoes because he's on holy ground, which is what happens when Moses sees the burning bush. So you think, is there something more than that going on? And so people have debated as to whether or not this is called a Christophany, which just means an
Mm-hmm.
appearance of Jesus, kind of a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. And there are several of these. So take Melchizedek, for example.
Right.
Melchizedek is this weird figure in Genesis chapter 14. There's no lineage, there's no beginning, there's no end. He's the king of peace. Hebrews picks this up and says, there's these two figures, Jesus and Melchizedek, that are in this category, and nobody else is in it. So people have thought, is this Melchizedek kind of Jesus before Jesus? Is this commander of the Lord's army Jesus before Jesus? There are a couple of others. There's several times where you see the
Mm-hmm.
angel of the Lord who speaks with the authority of God, and people say, "Is this Jesus?" Hard to decide, and I think there's really good scholarship on both sides of this. What do you think about the pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus, and is this one of them?
That's a great question. First, a disclaimer. I have to tell you that my view of this passage is permanently skewed ever since I saw the Veggie Tales episode. I remember Junior Asparagus is the commander of the Lord's army, and I can't read this without seeing it. So take this for what it's worth. But to answer your question, I do know there are good arguments all around. Is this an angel, an archangel, perhaps? I think it is Christ, and there are two reasons I think so. Because the fact that this figure allows Joshua to worship him, and I understand that word can mean something less than worship, but
Hmm.
everywhere else you see angels, you don't see them allowing worship or bowing down. In fact, you would say, "Get up, you don't worship me." So that is a hint to me. But the bigger issue is take off your shoes or your sandals. This figure says to Joshua, take off your sandals for you're standing on holy ground. This is so Moses in the burning bush. And so
Hmm.
standing on holy ground to me is an even stronger indication that this is more than an angel that you're speaking to, because that doesn't happen with angels. And so those things lead me to believe that this is Jesus. It also leads me to believe, Cole, that you could ask yourself, why is he here? Why is he here with an angelic army? They don't, they don't show up in the battle of Joshua. I think, and we know this to be true, that there is a battle going on in more than one plane of existence. That yes, Joshua is fighting against the Canaanites and the enemies, but there is a spiritual battle as well. There is a
Hmm.
battle of God against the forces of Satan as well. So in a nutshell, I lean toward this being a Christ figure just because of the way this is described. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm maybe more skeptical about the pre-incarnate appearances because I think the Bible is so clear that Jesus is incarnate once. But that
Hmm.
doesn't mean that he can't enter into the world without taking on flesh. He
Hmm.
could in some way appear spiritually, as a spiritual being, as opposed to when he comes and is born of Mary as a person. So I think as long as we keep that straight, this is not, that's where I feel like you have a much harder time with Melchizedek. Is Melchizedek certainly seems like an incarnate person, in which case we would have to say, uh, it's hard to square how Jesus could be incarnate, pre-incarnate, as if
Hmm.
he's been incarnated twice. He's only been incarnate once. But could
Hmm.
he appear here as
Hmm.
Joshua describes as an angel, the commander of the Lord's army? It's possible. It's very possible. And we don't know. I think the points that you make it probably the one place where you see the most things align that would make you think this is this person has the authority of God. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think you know, the worship, the holy ground, the equivalence with the burning bush is a definite vote towards this being Jesus. Now, the other thing too, going back to the book of Jude, which we talked about when we did Numbers,
Hmm.
Jude and presumably others had no problem attributing actions in the Old Testament to
Right.
Jesus. Like you're saying about the spiritual war that's going on, Jude doesn't have any problem saying he took that whole group of people and punished them for their rebellion. That was
Right.
Jesus doing that. So
Right.
that maybe adds us in a nod too that Jesus can be involved and he can be operative in the Old Testament, and
Hmm.
maybe he's doing it by this vision, to Joshua before he's incarnate in flesh.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Jude talks about Jesus is the one that led them out of Israel, or I mean, out of Egypt. Pardon me, the Exodus, and so you get this sense of a, a close identification of Jesus and God, a la John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. You get this very Trinitarian, almost indivisible view of who did what. Was it God? Was it Jesus? And the answer is yes, it was.
Hmm.
And so, in that sense, I could see this being true that Jesus isn't a newcomer onto the scene of history when he's born as a baby. He's incarnated into flesh then, but he's not a newcomer to history.
There's a reason we didn't pick any passages. This is in chapter 5, and the next one we picked is in chapter 24. There's a reason we don't have any from about chapter 12 through, the 20s, because as I've said before, and I'll say it again, we have now entered the most boring part of the Bible. Not to say that it's not inspired. In fact, I think we did an episode on in our intro series about why there's some really amazing stuff here. But it is
Hmm.
tough sledding. The second half of Joshua is very tough sledding. It's a description of the land that is given to the people of Israel when they come into the promised land. And this is minutia. This would be like, in
Hmm.
modern terms, this would be like Google Earth coordinates shared for about 12 chapters in the Old Testament.
Right.
It's like it runs from this river to this hill to this field. It's on the other side of that. And this family got that. And then next to them is this and this and this and this. It's a difficult part, but there's two really important passages at the end of Joshua that are other places where we can see Jesus. One of them is a very famous passage in Joshua. In fact,
Hmm.
this maybe we could vote this the verse that you're most likely to see on the wall in somebody's house on a nice plaque or something, and that is
Right.
Joshua 24:14 through 15.
Yes, this is the famous passage where Joshua is speaking to the people, and he said, "You're going to have to make a choice," basically. He said, "If you think that the Baals are God, then serve them. And if you think Yahweh is God, serve him. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." That's just the most famous passage. Well, why does that look forward to Jesus? Because there's a choice to be made. There's a division happening. You can't serve, as Jesus said, God and money. No one can serve two masters. Jesus is also calling for commitment, for faith, that your faith can't really be divided. He said, I came to bring a sword, not meaning literally he came to kill people, but he came to divide because a choice is required. And so, this idea of total allegiance to God or allegiance to anything else, you see it here in Joshua, and it is the call of the gospel. To whom will you give your allegiance?
Yeah, the call for Israel is very similar to the call you see for Christians.
Hmm.
There's a way of the world, and then there's the way that God has given us. And there's a broad path and there's a narrow path. And these
Right.
statements in the Old Testament translate very well to what Jesus is preaching in the New Testament. And I love this because this is Joshua reflecting back on his life of faithfulness in serving God. And so he's saying, no matter what comes, our family, we're going to serve God and we're going to follow him. And they're making a covenant essentially at this point. Once they get into the land, they've been given rest, temporary rest. They're making a covenant and they're committing themselves to God. And that's essentially what every convert is doing. They're entering into a new covenant with God and they're pledging
Hmm.
themselves to him to follow him. And of course, this is a very meaningful passage to families as well, that we as a family are going to live in the way of Jesus. We're going to live like God tells us. We're going to do what he says, even when it's unpopular or it's difficult or it's not what our friends are doing. We're going to commit as a family to follow and serve God.
Absolutely. I do think again, when we were talking about Deuteronomy, we talked about how we tend to think of it as the law and we tend to think of Jesus as grace, but we made the connection and said, really, it's the same economy of God, that there's obedience, there's disobedience, there's justice, and we saw Jesus in paying that price. You see the same thing here, that what Joshua was calling the Israelites to is the exact same thing that we're called to. Whom will you serve? I think of Luke chapter 9, where Jesus says, if you want to come after me, you must deny yourself. That's our favorite idol. Sometimes we think of idols being outside. I am my favorite idol. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. There's a daily decision, if you will, but really a daily dying to the world and living for Christ. It's the exact same idea. It doesn't change. I just really am passionate for people to see that the Old Testament is not different than the New Testament. The same idea is there. It's just Jesus becomes the greater deliverer even than Joshua was.
Right. Yeah, for all of Joshua's military victories, he can't free the people from sin. They get into
Right.
the promised land, they've been given rest, they've defeated their enemies, although not completely, as we'll see later in the books that we'll go through. But that can't remove sin from the people's hearts. And the wandering in the wilderness, all that God has done for them can't really heal their hearts from sin and from rebellion. But
Hmm.
Jesus comes and does just that. So he's a true and greater Joshua in that sense. I want to shift in the last passage that we picked to talk about here is at the very end of all these land designations. And if you're reading through on a Bible reading plan, or if you're trying to sit down and read through Joshua, this is worth every bit of getting through these chapters to see this passage. This is in Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45. And it's where we read, thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All had come to pass. Now, this is a big time statement because if you go
Hmm.
back through the Torah, there are a ton of promises that God has made specifically to Israel. There's a ton that were made that we know would be fulfilled in the future, but there were a ton locally in a short term made to Israel. He was going to bring them out, he was going to give them a law, he was going to bring them into the land, give them rest all around. He was going to be their God, they were going to be his people. And I think the reason you have, 9 chapters of dividing up the land and giving the coordinates and all of this is to show there was not a square foot of land that God had promised to these people or to Abraham for that matter
Hmm.
that hadn't been given when they were brought out of Egypt. God had kept his promise completely. And in order to show that he'd kept his promise completely, you have to get very specific because God doesn't want, very specific promises and very general answers. He's showing he gave very specific promises very specific answers to his people, and he can be trusted. Of course, the great way to see Jesus in this is that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the promises of God. And so
Hmm.
some were fulfilled to Israel then, some we're waiting on for the people of God, some we're waiting for the whole world to see the fulfillment of God's promises. And Paul says all the promises of God are yes and amen in Jesus Christ. And so, Joshua provides this glimpse into God being faithful with the land and with the promises and with what he promised his people coming out of Egypt. And here we see a look that Jesus will be the one who fulfills all the promises now and forever into eternity that God has promised his people for all time.
You're exactly right. And you've said before, and we all realize that God fulfills prophecy, fulfills his promises, sometimes immediately or in the short term in very specific ways. And then again in a more cosmic, I say, in a much bigger way. And it's a foreshadowing. Sometimes I call it a dress rehearsal, if you will, that Joshua is a dress rehearsal for Jesus. He brings these promises about by God's power in a tangible physical way, and Jesus is going to do it in an eternal spiritual way. And this is probably one of the great foreshadowings of Jesus, is that Joshua is the one in whom God made the promises come true, and Jesus is the one in whom God made every promise come true.
So in some sense, you get the end of a big storyline
Hmm.
where God has been working since the book of Exodus to bring his people out, to get them into the land. Now they're finally there. They've
Hmm.
got the law, they've got the tabernacle, they're worshiping God. And in
Right.
some sense, this is a completion. Of
Right.
course, it's not the final completion. There are still things that God is going to do. There's still issues. The book of Judges is kind of a harsh reality of life in
Hmm.
the land. It's a new land, but it's the same old people, and so their
Right.
problems follow them into the land. But there's a rest at the end of the book of Joshua that is a long time coming for the people of Israel. God has brought them. He's given them rest from their enemies. He's saved them. He's set them up. He's provided a place for them. It's not the Garden of Eden, but it's maybe the next best thing. It's the promise that he had given. They would have a land where they could live and they could worship him and they would be free from tyranny. Of course, that doesn't last very long. And in our next episode, we're going to do the book of Judges. Judges is the harsh return to reality in the Old Testament. If Joshua ends on a kind of triumphant note, Judges definitely brings us back down to earth.
Yes, because what has happened is God has fulfilled his promises. He's brought the people into the promised land, but there's still fallen humanity. And we will see that play out through Judges. And in a curious way, in my mind, Cole, the book of Judges is a demonstration that something greater is needed than the mere physical deliverance of the people. Judges, to me, puts the exclamation point on we need the Messiah.
That's right. And that's where we'll pick up on the next episode. We will look for Jesus in the book of Judges. We'll see you next time on the So We Speak podcast.